We were looking at the public buildings of the Italianate manner. And this is well, these are two. On the left is the second courthouse in the Dalles. There is another one later than that, which we mentioned. And then it is in a style that is very characteristically Italianate. A good deal of influence from books like that of Samuel Sloan. It's been attributed to Warren Haywood Williams. I'm not sure that I think that's entirely correct, but that probably is as good as any if you need to know it. Designed about 1881, built in 82-84. Now, on the right is the Jacksonville Courthouse, which was the second courthouse for Jackson County. And although it is no longer used as a courthouse, since the county seat was moved to Medford in this century, it is preserved very well indeed, and it is, as you see, very similar in style in this Italianate manner. The builder may have been a man from Ashland by the name of Payne, G.E. Payne, and a man named Marsh, also of Ashland, was the contractor. You'll notice that it had the main courtroom on the second floor. That was very often the case. That was the case in those earlier buildings too. And they both have a cupola, bell tower to distinguish their civic nature. It's interesting to see this old photograph. It's a brick photograph showing the rather remarkable fence, big, to keep animals out, but it doesn't keep the urchins from crawling up on top. Here is Jacksonville, still very well preserved. That roof on the porch is not correct. It's a sort of bungalow addition that when you get that collar roof, we haven't got to that yet, but the rest of it, the columns are all right. And the detail, and this is the detail of one of the windows. And you see it's Italianate. And it allows for all kinds of shapes, like even square-headed windows, though usually arched. You see under a segmental arch, then there are two round arched windows divided in two. And there it is in a photograph showing it in color. Now, somewhat similar to it in general character is the courthouse that you're seeing here. As it was in Pendleton, and it is Italianate as well, and it had a few more towers than most of them did, but it's gone now, been removed. And there you see it as it was in its later phases, central tower, but the little turrets on the wings have disappeared. As it is said, the Pendleton Courthouse, Umatilla County. Don't know who the architect was, but it had some iron windowsills, and they were made in Albany, Oregon, at the foundry of Cherry and Parks, which was one of the rather active foundries in this period, and it dates from 1888. There's a detail of the porch as it was. It's a really handsome building, very similar to Jacksonville. Perhaps it's actually a little bit more Italian in detail than the Jacksonville one was. As you see, some sculpture ornamentation, and then that central tower. The last of that general character that I could show you, and one that is still standing, fortunately, is the Benton County Courthouse in Corvallis, which dates from 1888 also. The architect is a man named Delos, D-Neer, D-E-L-O-S, Neer, N-E-E-R. And it was built 1888, and it's in pretty good shape indeed. As I said, there's one major tower over the pavilion marking the entrance to the building. We'll see some other work by Mr. Neer because he continued to do courthouse designs. In fact, the one in Lane County, 10 years later, was his work, and it was in a Romanesque style, but we haven't got to that yet. He hadn't got that. 1888 would be possible, but it hadn't apparently come to him in that period. That's the same kind of architecture you see in the former Portland Central School, which, as I pointed out, was just across the street from the Pioneer Post Office, and on the site which was later occupied by the Portland Hotel, and then still later by a parking garage, and now by a fancy square, piazza, the Pioneer Square. At Willamette University, the main building, Waller Hall, is an example of this style that is used for institutional buildings very, very widely indeed. Waller Hall was built about 1864. It has been altered in a few instances. There's a print on the left of 1868 showing it as it was, more or less as it was constructed. Has a central, it's a cruciform building, a central tower. Notice they're always rather vertical proportions in these facades than it is red brick. The detailing around the porch and so forth has been altered. Wasn't quite as classical as it is now. That isn't a very good color slide. This is really the color it should have. That was the style that was used for institutions of learning of all kinds, but it happens that it was particularly associated with academic institutions operated by the Catholic Church, by orders of sisters. This is the Sacred Heart Academy in Salem that is said to have been the work of Piper and Burton, two Portland architects. Piper, big architect for Dede Hall, which is contemporary with this building. This is 1871 to 73, and that's about when Piper was doing it. And there's a detail. A use of narrow pilaster strips to give articulation to the facade, a rather heavily bracketed cornice, and again, segmental windows or round arch windows, as the case may be. We're going to have that variation. And here is a composite photograph, an old one, showing several of these academic buildings, these Catholic academic buildings, and you see the general character of the style. What is it? This one at the top right is this Sacred Heart Academy, as you see here. In Portland, there was St. Mary's Academy that is now, oh, I should say that was torn down, and St. Mary's Academy is torn down too. It was right downtown Portland, as it was another Catholic institution. St. Helens Hall, which is an Episcopal school, seen here, which combines an Italianate wing with a Second Empire wing. As it is said, the general design of the building, as you see, it was demolished as long ago as 1890, when a building of a Queen Anne character replaced it. We see later. This is the old Philomath College in Philomath, and the central portion of it is particularly in this Italian style. The wings are a little bit later. This one dates from 1867 for the central portion, but the wings date as late as 1905 to 7 with their rather heavily mansarded character. It's a rather handsome building. And you can see it, take the wing and the roof of the wings off, and you would see it very much like the others that we've been looking at. Now, we come to one right here, Dede Hall by Piper. And this is perhaps the best example of this whole category. But it is also Second Empire because it's got a wonderful mansard roof. And it's tall, vertical, seemingly without conscious thought, very well fitted to the kind of woods effect that surrounds it. But when it was built, of course, there weren't any trees like this around it. It was standing isolated. The only trees around were the condent oaks out there near the edge of the highway, and there were the fir trees that all came in later on. But as you see, if you didn't have the mansard, we could say it's Italianate like the Academy, but the mansard, of course, clearly marks it as having the French Second Empire influence. There's a photograph taken about 1900, which shows you the way it looked before the trees grew up, and where it was originally bare brick, it was covered over with a coat of thin stucco and given a gray character. Probably after its adjacent building, the Lard Hall, was built in 1885. This was begun in 1883. It was finished about 3 years later. It was a rather slow process. There wasn't really any money, and Piper is said to have practically contributed his design to the university. It was an infant university, and this was its first, and for some time, its only building. As you see it with its strong vertical character, with its procession of sharply marked recesses and advances, it's a very dramatic building. And perhaps it's better than if he tried to make it more subtly French, you know. It's really very schematic. What is it? Extraordinarily typical of the period of the 70s and 80s. And then you see a photograph of South Hall at Berkeley, which is very similar and just antedates this one a little. It antedates the Lard Hall a little bit. Dede Hall. South Hall, Berkeley, was built in 1873. Well, you know, that's when Dede Hall was started by a man named David Farquhar's son, and which has similar characteristics in detail. There you see the details, you know, round arch windows. Very simple use of brick to frame opening, and brick used very simply to provide for what would perhaps have been a more plastic kind of cornice had it been done abroad or even in the eastern United States. Well, it was added to and complemented in a way surpassed by the second building on site, which is the Lard Hall, which we're looking at here from the northwest, where we're seeing Dede Hall to the right and the Lard Hall to the left. And here are the two in an old print, and a print which shows, in fact, the leg of the cornerstone on this side for the Lard Hall. It combines the two. This print comes from that very useful magazine called The West Shore, which published illustrations of buildings all over the Northwest, not just Oregon. It was published in Portland, but not just Oregon, but Washington and the territories too. What do you see the two? Now you can see that although the Lard Hall has much more, what we say, French-like detail, it's perhaps not easy to say that it's any better. And of course, it's been fairly badly treated in the 20th century. One can hope that someday it will be restored to its similar to its original condition. I hope it will sometime happen. In the meantime, of course, it got one, which I'm not showing you, got that a dreadful theater attached to the other side of it. And this is the end of the building. This is the south end. It had been butchered up completely inside, and of course, much of the detail of the roof needs to be redone. Recently, the turret on the northeast corner has been worked on and repaired, and maybe someday the rest of it can be done too. And the south or the east porch has been fixed up. That was before the turret. Now this is brick, but it's covered with stucco, and it's given this impression of banded stonework. Very typical, and one could parallel two examples of the French Second Empire style in France. There was one other building designed by the same architect, Williams. It was on Skinner's Butte and was a little observatory, a remarkable achievement for the infant university. And it was, as you see, a little mansarded building in the same style as the Lard Hall, about the same time. It's just incredible. And one regrets the fact that it doesn't exist. It survived for a long time, but it became what was considered a nuisance. That's one way of getting rid of architecture. And it was deliberately blown up by a man who was the manager of the physical plant at the university. There are some especially interesting details of the Lard Hall, including some carving over both the east and west facade pavilions. There was this medallion with foliage and a coat of arms. This is on the west side. It was there. And it was taken up there in the slot between the theater and the Lard Hall. I'm afraid that was demolished. Again, the physical plant took it down. It's just incredible what damage can be done by people who are supposed to know better, but don't. And there we look at, once more, the two of them as they were supposedly around 1890, the late 80s, as you said, that would be a typical university. Well, now the mansarded style, the mansard does provide an extra floor in the height of the roof. And in its very simplified form, it could be very useful and, in fact, quite dignified. And so I'll show you a few examples of that. This is the Clarendon Hotel in Portland, about 1877, which shows that use, frame building. This is the Orphans' Home in Portland of 1884, which would make it come about the same time as the Lard Hall. But this is Italianate with a mansarded roof, but also some of that more stick-like character in the detailing. And then this is another example of it. This style was used for many academic buildings. This is the South Union School, built in 1890 in Union, Oregon, and destroyed after I took this picture, was in 1969. Well, the most impressive example of the Second Empire applied to a commercial building was undoubtedly this one, which was the Masonic Building in Portland, and this was designed by Piper, too, the man who did Dede Hall in 1872. And of course here, in a more metropolitan center and with more money to spend, this Masonic Building is rather richer and more elaborate, but it long since has gone, so no longer there. This shows it in an old photograph built in 1872. And that would be the same kind of thing that you had in the Chimney Hotel, later called the Marion Hotel in Salem. And this building is also by Piper, about 1870. That's the way it was in its last phases. And oh, I thought I had a slide of it before. Maybe I do. Yeah, there it is. That is the Chimney or Marion Hotel, and that's what it had originally had a mansard, you see. Now, it stood until comparatively recently. It was torn down only some few years ago, in the 70s. That same style that's applied to this building, Sharp's Furniture Store in Portland, with a piling up of a lot of Second Empire ornament around the top of it. Or you have something like the State Insurance Office Company of 1888. It photograph taken in 1954. The ground floor had been altered, but now the whole thing is gone. Hard to find anything. Well, it seems rather extreme. It is really the Second Empire to the nth degree, I suppose, that it was used for warehouses and mills. And this is the Scotch Mills, a photograph, built probably in 1885. The photograph is later, but they don't exist now, in Salem. And it shows this mansarded building applied to a purely utilitarian structure. Here is one that is now gone, I believe, too, but it was there. I took this. This is the LeGrand Milling Company in LeGrand, Oregon. One of the few interesting buildings of that period in the ground. Now, we have not looked at houses, and we must look at houses because this was obviously a style that appealed to the woman who wanted to have some sophisticated grandeur. You know, this purely utilitarian. It somehow appeals to the 20th century eye, maybe more than the houses do. Well, there's the kind of thing from which this sort of design developed and spread. There is a book by a man named Hobbes. He wrote a book which is published under Hobbes' Architecture of 1873, and this is one of the designs in that, and he called it a French villa. We have mentioned before that compositions with towers were often called Italian villas, but of course with the mansard it has to be a French villa. The best example, and it's still standing, is the Cam House, the Jacob Cam House in Portland, which was built about 1871 or 2, and it may have been the work of Justice Crumbine. This is as it was on its original site downtown, a very handsome building, wood, mansard, and with quite elaborate details. When it was moved, it got a new site up there. The so-called colony area was acquired by Eric Ladd and formed the main focus of that group of buildings called the colony. When the Portland Hotel was demolished later, he acquired some of the ironwork, and the ironwork, which you see there, the front of it was from the ironwork around the Portland Hotel. Well, it was very fashionable. Here is what it looks like in the grandest possible way. The governor's mansion in Sacramento, built in 1877, 78, and by an architect named Nathaniel Goodell. There is another one of these designs from Downing, the 1873 edition. Now remember, Downing had been dead for some time, but his successors kept on publishing this, as it says in Downing. He called it an architect's residence. And there is an example of perhaps what they were thinking of in the fact of a house that's also gone. This is the Dr. Thomas Lamb Elliott House, formerly in Portland. Every time you get it into Oregon, no matter how fancy it is, it's bleaker and barer than it would be in Sacramento or California. Oh, there's still another one called Cook's Hotel of 1886, which was in Salem, bleak. As you said, the mansard is what gives it its sort of distinction, as you see there. Now here is the way it's spread out over the country. This is a little house in Baker of 1887. The David Heilner house had some nice trees around it, rather hiding it. But there, a later photograph shows the shape of the mansard and the porch, and the trees are gone. Well, it looks better, I think, with the trees, but that's the way it was nearly everywhere. People wanted to have that. This is what is called a model residence, and this comes from Hobbes' book again. Now, there on the left is the house that was perhaps the grandest of these, the Ladd House in Salem, Portland, beg your pardon, and it was occupied 2 whole blocks. Well, some occupied a block, this occupied 2 blocks, and it really was, quite an elaborate house. Then he said the Ladd House. Well, this house, I must have one here that shows the house. Oh, there's the Cam House. I got something out of order here again to show you this. And there is the house in San Francisco that is one of the most elaborate of all these houses, which is the Charles Crocker House. up on Nob Hill in San Francisco, and once more the Cam House to see it in relation to it. This is the other house from one plan books. Heavy-handed, one would say, but and this is just to show you, this is one of the typical houses in Back Bay, Boston. This was the William C. Endicott House of 1871. And there were a lot of houses there in the Back Bay area that followed the Second Empire style. Walk along streets like Commonwealth Avenue, and you find many examples of it. And there is a little house, again, from one of these planned books. And here is a house from Port Townsend. So just to show you that it goes all over, this is the house in Port Townsend, shouldn't it? The Frank Bartlett House, 1883 in Port Townsend. One story and a mansard, one story and a mansard there. This is the house, believe it or not, that you're seeing on the left at the time of purchase. And you see it's been improved, so it's become mansard. This, today, of course, one would accept this as far more interesting than the other, but that's not for us to say. We do things just as strange. But there you could find these scattered about over the state, or you could. I don't have very many examples of them, but this one was in Roseburg, but it's, I believe, it's gone. A photograph taken in 57, but it's been since restored, or destroyed, rather. And here was one that was in rather bad shape, was in Monroe, of all places. One-story mansard house. And it was moved. I'm told it was going to be restored in Corvallis, but I've never seen it since it has been. It was, this is as it had not been restored or rebuilt, a little house in Monroe. Well, I'm going to go over a group of churches that belonged to the period of the 70s, 80s, into the early 90s. And going back a little bit to point out that from the very beginning, the churches might have had a Gothic character. And this is, of course, a church in Portland, the only one that's there. Which one am I using? Maybe this. All right, I got it now. Jacksonville is surviving, St. Joseph's Church in Jacksonville of 1858, and it's similar to the one that was from the Kukul and Dressel print of 1858 of Portland. Building that has, if we took away the Gothic pointed arches for windows, and so it would be a little classic building. But that was going to disappear in the effort to create a more medieval character. Greater verticality, and this is the Episcopal Church in Milwaukee, as it was when it was still in Milwaukee, but it had been much added to, greatly expanded, and then, of course, it was moved up to southeast Portland. But this goes a little later, but we're coming into this phase. Now, the whole group of churches that belong to the 70s, designed by a man named David Nevius, and Nevius was one of the major builders of churches throughout not only Oregon, but the Northwest. I'm not going to show you very much of it. I don't really have all the detail. David Powers has made a special study of Nevius, and you may be able to hear him talk on it someday, but I didn't get him organized into this year. Anyway, about the middle 70s, about 1876, the date of the couple of churches that I'm going to show you. He did quite a few. They were probably based on some kind of plan that was disseminated by Episcopal missionary societies in the East. And they were intended to be very simple. They are, and they're wood, and they're the Gothic style, and they have a kind of effect of half timbering. This is the St. Thomas Church in Canyon City. They have survived in Canyon City and in Cove, and there were parts of them that could still be seen in some places like Baker and Pendleton, but I don't know whether we can still pick out much of that anymore. When I first saw the church in Baker, you could see that it had once been a Nevius church. Well, this is a very charming and very small example, and out there in that rather brutal countryside, it looks quite fine. It's very simple. There's an interior view with sort of scissors trusses, and let's take away some of the modern conveniences. There's the lighting fixtures and the heating and so forth, that it's a simple Gothic church. It's been restored, and the paint has been presumably restored to what it should have been. It is painted in more subdued tones here. This is the Canyon City Church, and this is probably a pretty good example of what we should expect it to have been like. But it's not, I think I rather liked it before with its rather harsher color. Out at the back of it was a little outhouse, a small version of the same kind of, when they had these wooden props in lieu of flying buttons. Didn't need buttons, but maybe it did need the props against the wind of Central Oregon. The other church that I could mention is one in Cove in eastern Oregon, and here it is. Obviously it's painted white, probably it was not originally white. And it's also nevious, and this is the side view of it, and it has buttresses here. They're boxed in, but they're just members of wood leaning up against the church. A very simple, small example. Adjacent to it was a little rectory, and this is a domestic version of the same kind of rural Gothic style, really rural Gothic style. Well, about the same time, on a more elaborate and certainly more lavish style, is the First United Methodist Church in, as it is called now, in Salem. And this is built in 1871 to 78. The design is said to have been made by a man named Cuss Chapman of Chicago, but it was completed and built by a local architect, William Boothby. I was said 1877 to 78. Just looking at the side. It is a cruciform building, but it has an auditorium-like hall. It doesn't have aisles. It's not a liturgical building. It's designed as a preaching church, as Methodist and all kinds of Protestant churches would be. And a very handsome, tall tower, and the front of it perhaps didn't come off as well as some of the other parts, but there it is, and it has the rose window, doorway, and the tower off to one corner. And I think I brought a slide showing you, looking up, well, there's the spire, certainly in addition to the landscape, the townscape of Salem. And alas, we don't have very many of those tall, slender spires left. There's the front of it with this, which is sort of a keystone, but it's up there between the gables of the porch entrances. That gives you the actual date of construction of the Methodist church here, the stone tablet on the facade. This is a version in wood of a similar Gothic church of the 70s, 76 to 78, and it is the Presbyterian Church, sometimes called the Old Scotch Church in Tualatin Plains to the southwest of Portland. A very nice, simple building. I don't know the architect for it. In Jacksonville, the Presbyterians got their church built in 1881. 81. This is a brick photograph of 1885 when it was new. And we don't know the actual architect. It's odd because the Reverend Mr. Williams, who was the minister of the Presbyterian Church there, was very anxious to describe the church, but he never mentioned who designed it or where they got the design. And he traveled around quite a bit, visiting various synods and so forth, church meetings, and he probably did know that there was another church just really like this in Eugene, which is the same, was the Presbyterian Church in Eugene. Now, it was apparently painted in more than one color to bring out an effect, perhaps, of half timber construction. It may seem to be a little odd, but it did have its auditorium was on the second level. and there was a meeting room underneath which could be used primarily as a Sunday school room. Once again, you notice the high fence around it to keep the nasty animals from coming in around the church. I mean, the next thing I must expect to read in the paper will be that people in Springfield who are now encouraged to have pet pigs will have to build fences around their property. Certainly a good idea. I mean, they weren't pets necessarily in the 80s, but they were roofs and cattle too, and so they have these high fences. Now, the curious little arrangement, because you see the stairs don't go quite up to the main level. You go up to a sort of intermediate landing, and then you go in, and then there's few little winders going up to the main church level. I don't know why that should be. And I don't suppose it was original in Jacksonville, but it was there in others. This is the way it was when I first knew it. And it was yellow and sort of umber. As you can see, the stairway goes up to it on the left. And the ground floor was gray. And the woodwork was scored off to create the impression of stone masonry. There was a little mortar joint, but it was all wood. And the glass is non-representational, but there was a statement saying in some of the records that it came from Italy. Well, it could have come from Italy. I don't know. And here on the right-hand side is an extraordinary chimney, which is, of course, a wooden casing surrounding a chimney. There is the main window at the end of the church. It's actually on the south end. It's not, hardly any of these churches are liturgically oriented. Liturgically oriented would mean that the sanctuary or altar would be toward the east. But, well, how many of them are there, even now in Oregon, that are properly oriented? The Catholic Church downtown is not backwards. The Episcopal Church is oriented with this sanctuary toward the east, St. Mary's on 13th. But not very, back in the 19th century, they weren't very, and it's hard, I don't think they paid much attention to that. They weren't that liturgically minded. Now that was the way the color was, and it was very, very attractive. Then the color was faded, and they wanted to improve it, and naturally they did improve it, and they painted it white. Before we show you that view, here is our photograph of the churches in Eugene. And here is the Presbyterian Church. It was a mirrored plan. So the doorway was on this side, but otherwise it was very similar indeed. And it was the most Gothic, and it must have been the most impressive church. The Episcopal Church was very simple, so was the Methodist, the Christian Church, and the Baptist Church, getting right down the scale. And the Presbyterians were, generally speaking, a rather prosperous community. And perhaps they were a bit worldly, too. I should know. There is a design published in one of the later editions of Downing again. Oh, you never get over Downing. But again, it was in the edition of 1873, and he calls it a rural church, whoever designed it. And it's similar, but it's all on one level. It was a very nice tower, and quite obviously it had different colored treatment, and the different colored treatment applies also to the shingles. And you can see the patterned shingles, colors and so forth. They like that kind of thing. There's a church that used to stand in Oakland, which was in fact the Presbyterian Church, and it was torn down a few years back. It might have had better color arrangements in its original state than it did here. And here is a church which I see to be in the Presbyterian section right now. This is the Episcopal Church in Astoria, which dates from, we're going to get back to the Presbyterians in a minute or two though. This is Grace Episcopal Church. The Cornerstone dated at 1885, The plans are by a man named Leik, L-E-I-C-K. This is the exterior of it, painted white, and probably it wasn't originally white. It is Gothic, but it's sort of castellated Gothic. And there's one view of the interior, gives you a little idea of the character of the inside. Not a very good photograph. I didn't get a good photograph of it. That's Grace Episcopal Church in Astoria. This is the Newman, the Methodist Church in Grants Pass of 1889 to 90, and I have the interior of it. I think we can show a little bit better of that, maybe. There's a part of it. Well, you see, it's really a group church that, regardless of the style, there's nothing like that in the Middle Ages, of course, with the kind of auditorium, but all the Protestant churches would have this kind of preaching hall-like arrangement. And you notice that the pews are arranged to focus on the pulpit, and certainly not on the altar, and whatever might have happened later on, because later on sometimes they changed that. This is the one-time Presbyterian Church in Albany of 1891, and it's a rather bleak example, but the same kind of Gothic style. Then, the masterpiece of the Gothic, of the wooden Gothic especially, was this church, St. Mary's Church in Albany, which was built in 1891, finished in 96 to 97, and alas, it burned down last year. Obviously, it was torched. It was a tragic loss because it was perhaps the most interesting church of its kind in the state of Oregon and maybe on the whole West Coast. This is the front, and with a kind of Rhenish, Rhinelandish sort of composition, very curious, building up in a kind of big tall front, and a little asymmetrical because there is a little baptistry section there under that turret to the left as we look. I don't know the architect. It would be too bad. I don't suppose it could ever be rebuilt. It would be impossible. Looking at it at an angle, impressive building, and rather good size, though not, of course, extraordinary. There's another view of it, just to get a feeling for the whole thing with its pointed windows, and its very picturesque composition. I have a few slides of the interior. The interior came to me as a great surprise because it does not seem to follow the general scheme of the masses in the volume seen from the exterior. And we're here looking from a choir loft. Remember, this is a Catholic church. A choir loft toward the altar. And it does appear to have a nave and side aisle. But it isn't quite like that. It is as simple as that. The aisles have kind of a mixed up effect of transept on each side. And you see, it was all stained wood inside. And there was quite a lot of interesting glass, which, alas, all went down in the flames. There's a view on the ground level looking back at it, and you see how we're looking really through this kind of pseudo-aisle, which has a kind of transept projecting beyond it. Well, there'll never be another one like it, I'm sure. There's a view, I guess another view of that. This is the rear end of it, the apsidal end. And once again, it really wasn't oriented, because this apsidal end faced south. This is looking to the south. And a great combination of windows that somebody must have been very interested in making sort of an abstract composition of windows. And the windows had wooden frames, which, you see like this, and those same wooden frames occur in the Newman Methodist Church in Grants Pass, as this is a view of the Grants Pass Church. What he said that. They may have been produced in Albany, who knows? And it may have been that they could be found in other places too as a sort of standard window pattern. Quite exceptional in this general group is this little church in Dayton, which is a Baptist church. It is dated 1886. A very small box of brick. and with a very steep roof, and just segmental arches and one round arch for the door. It's rather more Italianate in general character, but obviously its proportions suggest that it's Gothic in its intention. This is another church of the same period. This is St. Peter's Roman Catholic Church in the Dalles. It was designed by a man named Otto Kleemann, K-L-E-E-M-A-N-N, said to have been after a German design, and I can well believe it. It's again sort of a Rhenish form, brick, North German, very vertical, pretty interesting sort of tower, and quite impressive in general, but not very large. St. Peter's Church. There's a view of the sanctuary and the apsidal end, polygonal, and with the buttresses, wall buttresses running up the sides, with this composition of double windows with rows above. This is an interior view, better than any I had. Professor Mackenzie took this one and does show the character of it inside. Alas, it is not really a church. It's now a little museum. Now, we'll come to a group of most impressive churches of all this period, and they bring us right up to into the 1890s. I'll take up the first one. This is a design which has been preserved for, I forget I only have one slide, for the church that was Calvary Presbyterian Church. And they have a set of drawings of it that existed. They were made by a man named Joseph Sherwin about 1880. But they were rejected, and the building was built in 1882 by Warren Haywood Williams. However, as you'll see when we get to the photograph of the church, it's very similar. Now, the congregation moved away, and this was almost derelict for a long time, and now it's called the Old Church and used for a social center rather than a church. This is so. After it's really quite impressive in many ways, but remember, he didn't do that. Now, this is the side elevation, and it was quite elaborate, as you can see. This is the church as it is, and as it was. It had, as proper for a church which had high-class clientele, a porte cochere, so people could drive up to their carriages and get out under cover. It has an interesting organ, and when we used to have our little tours up there, we sometimes had somebody play the organ. Arthur Hahn had been known to play the organ in the church. This is all painted white. I think perhaps it was not always white in the beginning, and the drawings of the design by Joseph Sherwin show a kind of ochre and tan effect. There's a detail along the side of one of the windows. The stained glass windows are not remarkable, but they are at least of the period of the very late 80s. The better example of this period is, of course, this masterpiece, and really is a masterpiece. And this is, in its way, is the parallel to that church in Albany. I hope this one doesn't get torched. This is the first Presbyterian church in Portland. A little difficult to photograph at mass because it's been hemmed in by other buildings, but as you see, it has a notable tower and spire. Professor Conan said that he thought it had been based on a design for a railway station in Worcester, Massachusetts. And he knew about that. I don't know. The first Presbyterian church of 1886 to 89, probably by the architects McCaw, Martin, and White. There tends to be a feeling now to say that it's mostly by Manson White. I don't know about that, but anyway. And it is stone, right? And it has a marvelous, really truly marvelous wooden interior. There's the church tower and spire. It is, once again, a preaching church. It doesn't have a longitudinal axis. And, of course, it isn't oriented, but then Presbyterians don't really care about that. And the apse, well, if it had an apse, which it doesn't, of course, but the pulpit is on the west side. This is the east facade that we're looking at here toward the northeast corner. There is the front of the church on the east side, and has quite a remarkable big stained glass window. Very typical of the 1890s. And this is Sid's carved a little sort of gallery across the front of it, and there was a porte cochere over there too, on that side, for the carriage tray. This is still the First Presbyterian Church, and still, I hope, prosperous enough to stay that way. There, you see the porte cochere has gotten swamped in by buildings next to it. I think perhaps it's my favorite church now of the 19th century. Here we are looking from, these churches are very, very difficult to photograph inside. We are looking from the balcony, which is over the entrance to the church, toward what I suppose one can only call the sanctuary end of it. And we're looking down here, as it is said, there's reading desk, pulpit, and the chairs for the minister and the clergy. And then above that, projecting right over it, is the choir seat, and it's a screen that conceals the organ. And you see the timber framework of the roof. Now that's the proper way to look at things in a Protestant. Of course, it doesn't work in a Catholic church, but in a Protestant church, the choir was to be seen and would be up there in the front and just above the minister. And so it really starts out in a series. First of all, there's a little platform for the communion table, not an altar. And then there's the platform for the pulpit and the benches for the minister and his assistants. And then there's the choir, with the choir loft and organ right in the front. Very typical of a 19th century church. And this is looking at a corner of it, so that you're getting a view of the corner. You'll see the choir screen, and there's a balcony that runs around and has a kind of violin-like shape in plan, and comes around from the back on it, goes around, and here is the pulpit, and here is the minister's seat with his assistant, and then there's seats for the elders, who can on occasion be moved down to this level when they're dealing with the community service. And many, many interesting factors about this church. There's some interesting tile work in the vestibule. Oh, it's the English tile. They're quite attractive. Somewhat similar, in fact, to some tile that occurs in the United States Capitol in Washington. This shows the balcony looking along the side. And then I have to show you the window. Representational art, whether windows or not, was not very much appreciated by the Protestant sect of the 19th century, and not really proper, in my opinion, for that. This is about as far as you could go. Here is a cross. This is in the window over the entrance, so nobody can see it except the minister. It isn't going to disturb the feelings of the congregation. And it is a remarkable piece of stained glass. It is the old rugged cross, to be sure. And it's got great chunks of glass in it, three-dimensional. So you can't quite realize that, but it is really a sculptural window. And that's right up there. And the minister could, of course, see that, but the congregation couldn't possibly see it. Maybe they couldn't even turn around and see it, I suspect, at all. That's the church again. Now, just a little bit later, and very similar in its general composition and form, but not as well preserved inside, at any rate, as the First Presbyterian, is the First Congregational Church in Portland of 1890-91 by the architect Henry Hefty. It stands just across the street from what is now the extension of the Oregon Historical Society, and places on the park blocks. And what are now called the South Park blocks, as they were once. Remember, they were called the Boulevard. Now, this church, congregational, is based, obviously, on this design, reassembled somewhat. This is New Old South Church in Boston by Cummings and Sears. And it stands on a corner of Copley Square. There's the Boston Public Library, which we haven't got to yet, over there on the left. And then behind us, we haven't got to that either, would be Richardson's Trinity Church. This church is what would be called, I think, the best high Venetian Gothic, high Victorian Venetian Gothic, and designed by one of the leading firms in Boston, the first congregational church. Very handsome church. And obviously that would be a good source for the congregational church in Portland. But it was already perhaps going out of fashion. Here is the side, the flank of the Portland church, and I think this is the flank of New Old South Church in Boston. Here is one of those composite views again from a book called The Oregonian Souvenir, quite a remarkable collection of information published in 1890. And here it is. You see some of fine churches. Here's the First Presbyterian. Here is the Grace Methodist, gone. And there's St. Patrick's up there, we're going to show you this. There's Calvary Presbyterian, which we've seen, which is now the old church. And I think that's about it. The First Congregational isn't in it. There's the old First Congregation, you see. And they were just about to have a new one in 1891. This, by the way, was a rare example of sort of Queen Anne Church. The Grace Methodist gone. It was on 12th Avenue in Portland. Well, I show you this partly because up there on the left-hand side was the Temple Beth Israel, the earlier temple. Beth Israel, not the one that we now know. And here it is. And this is Temple Beth Israel, as it was built in 1888 by the architect Williams again, and Smith, Williams and Smith, in one of the good photographs by Angela's people. Really a great handsome. And it was down there, not on the park blocks, I think, but just to the west of it. In fact, it looks very odd, but it really was not as original as one might like to think. There was a temple in San Francisco of the same design. And Williams apparently just lifted it and used it again in Portland. Well, that's common enough even now. We can't blame them for that. Trinity Church, we're looking across that way. It's over on Commonwealth Avenue. And it shows, again, a Christiform church, but basically it's a big auditorium. But it does have a large apse. And of course, the Bell Square Church was for a Baptist congregation, and this is for Trinity Episcopal congregation, and this church had one of the very famous preachers of the period, Phillips Brooks. Phillips Brooks is memorialized in a sculpture by St. Gaudens under a little pavilion here at the side. And this is the church school attached to it, and it's made a combination of brown and cream-colored stone. It had always a plan with a central lantern. But this certainly is an improvement over that. That is more typically dated, I would say, than what actually this kind of picture. It is generally thought that Samuel White, who worked at Richardson's office, redesigned the central tower, and it is based on the tower of the old cathedral of Salamanca in Spain. I should have brought that in, but I assume that you know all those things, of course. The old cathedral of Salamanca is a Romanesque building. And the tower is one of a group of so-called Salamantine towers that proliferate in that region of the province of Salamanca. And I have to point this out because you understand that at the cathedral of Salamanca, the lantern comes over a crossing bay of a longitudinal building. And while it's square compared to some of the other bays, it's not greatly bigger. And here, of course, the tower really covers this whole, almost all of the central hall. Rises up, the transept wings do extend beyond it, but it pretty well covers the central space. And there, looking up at it, you can see how splendid it is. Shepley, Wickham, and Coolidge, after Richardson's death, in fact about 10 years later, did the porch and the little towers on the front, which were not there in the original building as was completed. The original building had a tripartite facade, but it didn't have a projecting porch. The net result is that it looks more like, well, it started out to look like Church of Arles, and it became sort of bigger and more Romanesque, French Romanesque, with the porch projecting across the front of it. There are several other things about it. This might be represented. He liked to use this polychrome stonework, and in patterns of checkerboard and chevron and so forth, those are actually features of stonework in Romanesque architecture. Romanesque architecture was highly regional, and he took from various parts of Romanesque design, mostly from South France. They come from different parts of South France, except for, of course, as I said, the lantern is really from Spanish Romanesque architecture from Salamanca. And there is a church that, I thought I had a plan. Oh yeah, here's Trinity Church. I knew it must have been a plan. This is the plan of Trinity Church, and you're looking at it with its vestibule towers, and you see that the lantern, it covers the great central section. And then there was this big, simple apse. In the 1930s, the altar arrangements were somewhat modified and made more liturgical by a well-known architect, Catholic architect, and I thought that was rather shocking to the Episcopalians at the time in the 1930s. There was a lot of rich decoration in the interior. I thought maybe I had an interior slide, but I probably didn't bring it in, huh? No. All right, we'll go back to that. And you just have to imagine that. Anyway, I want you to realize that it was a preaching church. And Phillips Brooks was, after all, known for his preaching. This is, of course, the pulpit right there. And so it was, the emphasis is on, there is a sanctuary and there's room for a choir that could march in and take the places, but it's basically a preaching church and not a liturgical church. Now, trying to make real Romanesque architecture into preaching spaces is difficult because it wasn't designed that way. Well, the style spread. I'll just show you one example because it shows how it could be interpreted. This is a church in Chicago called the Oakland Street Church, something like that, doesn't matter. And it is a church that I got from an old photograph. The photograph dates about 1890, and that brings us right about the time that this style was widespread throughout, and mostly for Protestant churches, not for, that is, for more evangelical churches rather than liturgical ones. But of course, there's both low church and high church Episcopal too. And that's what came into Oregon in this church, which is really the only good example of this style in Oregon. And this is the First Baptist Church in Portland, which is dated 1892 to 94. And the architect was a man named Warren Hayes of Minneapolis. I don't know the name of the architect for the Chicago church, the Oakland Methodist Church in Chicago, though. As it is said here, it is. It is very suggestive of the, but it doesn't come up to Richardson's work. But it's a good example of what I would call Richardsonian architecture. Very good. And it says they're both. It never has quite the amplitude, and the Chicago one doesn't either. That Richardson himself gave to these churches. It's like a different view. It is quite handsome. And it is one of the best preserved 19th century, late 1892 churches in Portland. Sometimes the light makes it even richer than it is in some of the other photographs of this flank side of it. It's a preaching hall, and the only photograph that I have is this one taken by one of the students when we went there for a visit one time. And it was looking down forward to the second. Well, I don't like to call this is the auditorium really in a church like this, really not a sanctuary. And you're looking toward the actual end of it with the organ up above, and with, as a matter of fact, of course, a Baptist church provision for a pool behind those screens, which can be pulled across because there has to be a plunge, dipping pool for the Baptists who believe in immersion. That style was carried, the last time I went through this, I think, was when Mr. Carter was president. And when he came to Portland on his campaign trip, he attended the service in this First Baptist Church. They were very pleased with that fact. So that, now, this is the way that kind of thing appeared in really literally hundreds of buildings over the country, but I'm afraid we don't have anything really quite so good as this in Oregon. This is the Chicago, so the slides got out of order here. Not good. This is the Richardsonian building by Richardson himself. This is the Ames building of 1882-83 in Boston, an office building and shops. And there on the left is a building in Chicago of 1882, now perhaps a little bit later, but not much, and designed by Burnham and Root. famous Chicago architect. They couldn't have done that without knowing about the work of Richardson. Of course, there were others besides this. What is a good building? Some building in Hartford, Connecticut, and elsewhere. We could go on and on. But this is the kind of thing that Richardson could inspire, and that's the way it would come out of that. That was the, I don't know what I'm going to get to next, Chicago Club. Richardson's design in Chicago that he did himself, which was done just the time of his death, was, in fact, his major commercial masterpiece, the Marshall Field Wholesale Warehouse of 1884-85, and you're seeing that over there. That building is a masterpiece of simplicity. It is not a metal frame building, though there was certainly some metal in it, but it wasn't a metal frame structure. And here is the same kind of thing at almost exactly the same time as that. This is the Rookery of 1885-86. It's overlapping by a year. And this is Burnham and Root in Chicago, and that was in Chicago too. But whenever I see, you can always feel a certain triviality about buildings. They're very fine in themselves, but when they see it compared with the real thing, they lose something. There wasn't any architect really in the United States who could accomplish that sort of thing which he did there in the Marshall Field Warehouse. And here is we'll see how we're getting along here now. This is the Auditorium Building in Chicago, which dates from 86 to 89. The architects Adler and Sullivan, they were one of the principal firms. This is Burnham and Root, Adler and Sullivan. And both of these buildings had metal frames. And they both have these Romanesque features. The Auditorium Building is perhaps more satisfactory in detail than the Rookery. And it had a big tower, and they had their office up to the top of the tower for some years. It included a theater, the Auditorium Theater, been restored in recent decades. And here on the Michigan Avenue side, there was the Auditorium Hotel. And there was a big dining room on the top floor. This became part of what was called Roosevelt University later on. And there is a last building by the Richardson firm, although he was gone, in Boston, simpler than the others, but it still certainly has the grandeur. It's the Ames Building in Boston of 1886-87. That's just after his death, by Shepley, Rutan, and Cooley. And this is just a detail to show you the character of the Auditorium Building, which is very good indeed. Sullivan was, of course, perhaps the most original architect after Richardson in the late 19th century in the United States. Now this is mostly brick. I would like a color slide of it. It's red brick, but it has tremendous great stone lintels on the ground floor. And it is this grouping of elements under these large arcades, and then at the top with a little sort of rippling effect with the kind of row of small windows. That he did, of course, at the Marshall Field Warehouse, and is true on the Auditorium Building as well. In Oregon, in Portland, this comes close to expressing the character, the quality of this Richardsonian Romanesque as anything that I know of. This is an addition to the Newmark block. This is the Newmark Annex of 1889, and it is attributed to McCaw and Martin. Probably, right. But a builder may have been a man named David Thompson. And this shows you, it's not a very large building. And it occupies about a quarter of a block, which isn't, of course, a very large space in Portland. The blocks are small in Portland, as they are in many of the older towns in Oregon. In fact, they're very small, mostly in Portland, only 200 feet square. And this There's the Newmark Theater, the west side. This is on the southwest corner. And it has a magnificent rough stone base. And above that, brick. And the brick is treated very elegantly. And there's some big arcade. And of course, it's really a warehouse. And so it only has windows on the main side, the street side. This is Ash Street running down there beside it. And it fills out, the other end of this street is the Pendleton block, which you saw back a day or two ago, I guess, and which is nice in its way, sort of an Italian design, but this is architecture. And this is what makes Richardson's influence so important. Alas, we didn't have very much of it, really, in the West. All the little details in this building are quite remarkable. As you say, the little feature, there's a side entranceway. Just look at the splendid stonework, as is another few of it, with the colors washed out, but it's the same entrance. And there are very little details about it. This is the Pendleton Building, see? And you see the scale of it. The DeYoung Building had a great portal, and alas, that's the way it is now. It has been modernized out of recognition. One could cry over the loss of buildings that were this way, not destroyed by earthquake, but by architects. On the left is the Oregonian Building, as it was, gone, long since now. The Oregonian Building by Reed and Reed of San Francisco, who latched on to the Richardsonian style. And it was a tall building with a tower downtown, but it was eventually destroyed. And it was clearly a good example, if not perfect. I think it never would have been quite as good as the, in detail anyway, but it was bigger and more impressive in its way than the little Newmark Annex. Now, this is a detail of the Oregon National Guard building. Oh, out of order completely today. That's the entrance to the DeYoung Building before they butchered up. I might as well give up. Things are getting out of order along here. Now, I'll go back to this one. This is the Oregon National Guard building in Portland. Some of it's gone, but most of it is still standing, as I recall. It was built in 87 to 91, and the earlier part was demolished later. Well, this is the detail. This is the rubber. Well, it would be suitable for an armory. What do you see? This kind of mass in it. I don't suppose it was originally whitewashed, but I'm not sure about that. You could maybe find out, but it has, I think it should have been brick, exposed brick above the stone base. Now, maybe we'll get into, yeah, here. On the left is the Goodenough building, or maybe pronounced Goodenough in Portland, which was built about the same time, 91 or so. And the one on the right here is the Chicago Standard Club by Adler Sullivan that was built in 87, 88 and has been long demolished. That is a typical example of a Richardsonian in the hands of very competent, in fact, very important architects. But it's not up to Richardson's own work, of course. There's a little detail of the Goodenough building, and then you're back. I think this is the stray got in here. Supposed to be maybe the Deacon building. Skip it. Anyway, then we come to the Hazeltree building, which is between here and on the other side too. Huh? I don't know. I'm certainly getting a lot of There. It's been restored. The Hazeltine building, but it was always an impressive building. As you see, it had stone, and then it was brick above, which was properly, I think, restored to the color, the red brick color. And this is it had a fine arcade of large openings on the ground floor, and then grouped up above. This is an excellent example of what can be done to preserve that. There's a detail of the ground floor arcade. Very impressive. But it's in scale. It's Richardsonian in scale. And there's a detail of the restored version with the whitewash gone and the stone and the brick as they should have been and were originally at the beginning. Oh. Somebody put the slides in upside down. Doesn't matter. Well, the ticket makes any great shape. And this is simply this happened to be in Seattle. I believe this is supposed to be the Pioneer Building. There's a very abundant crop of Romanesque building. And this is the Pioneer Building, very Richardsonian, by architects Elmer Fisher, Ralph Anderson, and over there on the other side is the Maynard Building by Wickersham, and there might be a detail of that, yes, coming up here. As you see, sometimes they're rather more restrained. They're maybe more, well, just Chicago school, but they're all Richardson in a way. And then this would be the college building in Seattle. And finally, the Mutual Life building in Seattle. This is part of Pioneer Square. What is it? They're handsome. Portland didn't burn down at that period. So we didn't really have a wave of Romanesque buildings, Richardsonian Romanesque buildings, as they do in Seattle, and in fact, as they do also in Spokane. I'm getting to lose track of my body. Still here. That's Seattle. And I guess I got out of order there a little bit. It's one of those buildings around Pioneer Square. Here's what I wanted to come to next. Back to Portland. And a building of very restrained character. It's the Concord Building of 1891. And it was designed by the firm of Whidden and Lewis, who had just come to Portland several years earlier to complete the Portland Hotel, which we'll see as an example of the Queen Anne style. And this was built for the Ladd family. And it was quite a handsome building. And it was reported on in the magazine at the time that it had used Japanese brick. The Japanese bricks were used to finish the building, and it's very true that it came out quite well. Well, another upside down thing again. There's a detail. The brick is perhaps a little bit different in size than the ordinary brick of the period, and it's in two different colors. Just forget trying to change the stripes now, too late. And it is the nice tawny color and then a tan. And among the other things you can see in this detail, it's sort of like hem stitching along the edges of the spheres. The brick are shaped so that they are angled off, and it gives that sort of hem stitch effect. Otherwise, there really isn't any problem about it. No. Where's it got? The top story is a little different. Well, just forget fooling around. Let's keep on going. Keep on trucking, as they say. Try this one again. The Hamilton Building, which is in the middle of this group, is also Whidden and Lewis, and it was dated from 1893, and it's said also to have Japanese brick. That's on the left of it is the building that's the Concord building. We've come back to that. And this is the Hamilton building, and then this other one on the left is I can't find what it is anymore. Loyalty Building. And this one is, this is the Gilbert Building. And the Gilbert Building of 1893 may perhaps be by Whidden and Lewis. Whidden and Lewis did the Hamilton Building, and perhaps this also has Japanese. I suppose that it was economical to, bring these bricks back in place of the timber that went out of Oregon to Japan then. Perhaps I shouldn't mention that even now, with all this furor about what to do with it. The Sherlock Building is similar to this building in Salt Lake City, the Dooley Block. And the Sherlock Building was built in 93 or maybe in 96 in Portland. I visited the Walker Warehouse in Chicago, Adler & Sullivan, and here is the perspective of the Dooley Block with the Hotel Ontario. This is Salt Lake City, and this is Adler & Sullivan. And you can see it really does look like the Sherlock Block, the Sherlock Building. The Sherlock Building has not, may have been designed by one of the main architects. This is a question, maybe by Manson White. It has been attributed to him. It's also been attributed to a man named Isaac Hodgson, Jr. And so I don't really know particular choice of that. But it now remains one of the best examples of that. This is the so-called Auditorium Building, which has its name on it, designed by Manson White, 1894-95. That's the Sherlock Building again. And this should come up here. It should be the right building, the Auditorium Building. Again, the Chicago School, perhaps, a little bit, perhaps Romanesque, but also somewhat maybe even Renaissance. But this kind of thing, and that might be actually based on Sullivan's kind of ornament. Sullivan was very interested in that kind of ornament. One of the most curious examples of this sort of thing is, in fact, West Hall at the University of Portland, which is actually based, yes indeed, actually copied, cribbed from one of Richardson's masterpieces. This is Richardson's Seaver Hall, S-E-V-E-R, at Harvard, of 1880, and there is this West Hall at Portland University, Catholic University. The Seaver Hall is probably the best of Richardson's academic buildings. He did another one at Harvard as well, Austin Hall, the law school, but this I think is better. And it is true that although it has sort of Romanesque features, it also has strong suggestions of the Queen Anne. I believe that they got kind of left out in Portland, but this doorway is not Romanesque. And perhaps it's true that this kind of decoration is not really very Romanesque either, this floral decoration in brick, and it's been ingeniously done. A very handsome building. And this is just a shadow of it, or a ghost of it here in Portland. Well, even if the bonds were removed, it wouldn't look very good. And they never were able, apparently, to complete the building, so it's only, 2/3 of the design. Seaver Hall has 2 bays and is symmetrical and very good indeed. There is another view of West Hall, important to stop beyond that second bay. And here is the detail of the doorway. Well, this is the Richardsonian Romanesque. He was actually farther removed from the Romanesque in his own work at Cedar Hall. And you see, this is a little bit trite. There's a detail of that bay at Cedar Hall to show you that, after all, it is a classical design, and it's got this wonderful cut brick. Yes, really. It's not very common, any kind. And it was a particularly good example of it. I think it was built as a classroom building, too. One of the only, all classroom buildings. I wouldn't say it was the first one for that purpose, but very nearly so at Harvard, when it was built in 1880. Now here we have a design that has been mutilated, the National Bank of the Republic, by one of the more eccentric architects, but also a very good one in Philadelphia, Frank Furness. And this building was destroyed some years ago. As you see, it is extraordinary. Is it Romanesque? Yes. And then, of course, this was altered it's been altered more than once on the ground level. And you have to look up above to see what it really could have been. The architect for this building in Salem was C.S. McNally. And I owe this information to a one-time student, Lee Nelson, who had discovered that particular fact from information. A curious building for a back, and the interior of it, originally in the ground floor, was perhaps a little bit more sort of American Renaissance, with kind of classical columns and so forth. But it didn't have it has some curious sort of ornamental glass work up there. And Henry Russell Hitchcock thought that maybe it really was Tiffany glass in that little window like that up there at the top. When I saw that one time in the Astoria, there wasn't much to be seen. It mostly just loft space. And I don't know how it was originally used, but originally it had the banking area on the ground floor. There's another photograph of it from a different angle. It's unusual. Well, it's like Seaver Hall. That is, to find a building in Oregon that is so definitely derivative of other buildings somewhere in the east. Seaver Hall in Cambridge was responsible for West Hall in Portland, the Capitol National Bank building. The National Bank of the Republic was responsible for the Capitol National Bank here in Salem. Now, at the end of this development, we have the design and then the construction of the Lard Railway Station in the state, that is the Union Station in Portland. And the Union Station in Portland, this drawing on the left shows it in 1882. It was proposed. And it was probably a design that came out of the McKim office, because McKim came out here to check out this sort of thing. And I can't say exactly how close this drawing of the station, as was proposed, this appeared in the West Shore, would be McKim, Mead, and Park. So you can see a big courtyard, train shed, spur coming in, and in reality the train shed is arranged differently so that they come in parallel with the back. And this is the station with the train shed at the back and with the station in the front. And here's the train shed again in the river with the ship of the mast sticking up there behind it. And that was designed by the architects were Van Brunt and Howe of Kansas City, who were architects primarily for the Union Pacific Railroad, who was the principal sponsor for this hotel. There is a rendering of the Union Pacific Depot by Van Brunt and Howe in Kansas City. There, a photograph of it. Tower, which unfortunately is somewhat marred by the advertising at the top, but really quite distinguished. It's a brick, rough cast stucco work over it, but the window frames are rubbed brick, and there is this bay, which opens into the lobby as a ticket area. Very good form indeed. It has been worked on several times, once about 1929 to 30 by no other than Mr. Beluski, but the detailing was mostly inside in the lobby area, the changes that were made then. Courthouse in Port Townsend in Washington, the Jefferson County Courthouse of 1891 by W.A. Richard. Another building of this sort of Chicago style, which is also perhaps somewhat Queen Anne-ish, we'll see how that fits later, was the Salem City Hall, which you see over there on the left. And there should have been another view of it. Disappeared into the midst of time. And finally, to end this up, the Eugene Lane County Courthouse of 1898 by the architect Dalles D. Near. And it's coming down. As it is really quite a pity that it went down. And there is, of course, this building, I think it's still standing. This is in Dalles, and also by Near, and done at about the same time, I believe 1902, the Polk County Courthouse, and the composition, this is a stone-faced building, whereas Eugene is brick, but the composition is practically identical with that of Eugene. And then here is another one of Dalles D. Near's building, so the last one I'm going to try to do in 1908, and again the composition, he used the same general composition for this building, which is the Baker County Courthouse in Baker in eastern Oregon. Well, I don't know what else we're going to get. This is a small sample of the domestic architecture of the Richardsonian mode. Richardson did do some houses himself, and I guess that you're not going to see that. This is one by Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, the Franklin McVeigh House in Chicago. This is the Dr. Mackenzie House, which is in Portland, and which was designed by Whidden and Lewis. We should have had the Ledbetter House, but I guess that's gone forever. Mackenzie House has some rather quaint features, which are surely Queen Anne rather than Romanesque, but it's basically, I think, meant to be a Romanesque style house. This is the house on Southwest King by Edgar Lazarus, and this is the Richardsonian type of house, quite clearly. Big, informal forms, stone and shingles, and, well, amen. Well, we're going to get into the Queen Anne. I don't think I'll finish it all today, partly because I have a great many slides to project, and because I rather like it. And I think it's important to realize that it's a style that isn't a style, and that there is really no actual, in the category of styles in England, in the days of Good Queen Anne. She was always called Good Queen Anne. I'm not sure quite why. She had, I think, 13 children, but none of them survived her. That's the way it was in the 17th and early 18th century. She reigned from 1702 to 1714 and was the last of the Stuarts. After her death, the succession passed to George I, who was related but not very close. He was from Hanover, or Hanover, whatever you want to call it. And the period, I should say, I suppose, that she was the daughter of James II of England. Her elder sister, Mary, who was married to the Prince of Orange, had ascended the throne first with William III, Mary II. And then after Mary died, and William reigned alone for a while, and then he died, and Anne succeeded. She'd been married to a prince of Denmark. I don't know anything really, I don't really know anything about him, but anyway, she did have a number of children, but none of them survived her, lived beyond her. Now, it's during that period, in the late 17th and early 18th century, that English architecture is not very clearly defined one way or another. And after Queen Anne's death, say, give or take about 10 years, we have the beginnings of the Palladian movement in England, sponsored by the patronage of Lord Burlington, of Richard Boyle, 3rd Earl of Burlington. And that became a very widespread, that's easily identifiable. But this late 17th and early 18th century one is not really easy. So that's why there's no very specific model. And it was picked up in England because, I think, of the very fact that it gave architects in the second half of the 19th century a considerable latitude in what they were going to do. There's a very good book by Marc Junelard. I didn't put it on the reserve because not really for this course, but it's called Sweetness and Light, the Queen Anne Movement, 1860 to 1900. Very good. And I also remind you, as some of you probably do know better than I do, that that's a period of Gilbert and Sullivan and their operetta Patience, which has a lot of remarks about the aesthetic movement. Queen Anne, first produced in 1881. And it was sort of poking fun at the aesthetic movement, of which movement was one of the main figures was, of course, Oscar Wilde. The song about as I walk down Piccadilly with a pop-vera lily in my medieval hand is supposed to be based on Wilde. I won't attempt to sing it. It would make you all ill. But anyway, it's a very interesting movement. It is also related to the pre-Raphaelite. The pre-Raphaelite movement is something separate, and it occurs only in painting, not in architecture. But one of the principal figures in the pre-Raphaelite movement was William Morris. And he, of course, did have, although he was not an architect himself, he had a very important influence on architecture, added to the development of the arts and crafts movement. I'll show you Morris's house in just a few minutes. I'm going to give you quite a bit of the background in England for this, because it does interest me, let's say that frankly. And secondly, I think the buildings are often very good. And toward the end of it, it kind of disappears into a sort of, it was freer, but by 1900, it was kind of breaking down into what we call perhaps Georgian. And although that may be very nice, it's not as significant as the earlier buildings, in my opinion. And you see again that, it's very free. There are awesome Gothic arches, but there are sash windows, not necessarily casement windows. They're different. And it was red brick and red tile. As we said, the principal room on the second floor, as we would call it, they would call it the first floor. That's just a better corner view where there was a nice stair that leads up to it. The Red House. Well, because Morris was responsible for so much of the arts and crafts movement, his company was called Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company to begin with, and then it was just Morris and Company. And he, as I said, although he had worked in Street's office for a short time, he was not really an architect, but he did design furniture, textiles, and toward the end of his life, he developed a master printing establishment. And he did magnificent books by William Morris. I think the library has some in the rare book department over here. They're very much admired and liked. He also wrote a good deal. And he was also a socialist. And so he preached for his ideas, of course, were that ordinary workmen and so forth should have good things around them. But that's never going to happen, I'm afraid. But this is a view from the side. And you see an oriel window projected there. And that's at the end of the living room, or the hall. And then there's a great chimney goes up, and there's there is a large chimney inside that. I won't take the time to go into the interior because we have too many things to show you. About the same time, you begin to find this sort of thing, which is a mixture of a certain amount of medieval features plus a certain amount of what we can only call Renaissance features. And the double-hung windows, for example. But there are casement windows up above. And this is a house. It happens to be another vicarage in the north of England, in Scarborough. And it's dated 1863, although Sir Nicholas Pesner thought perhaps that was too early for it. That would be put, that's 4 years later than William Morris Red House. And these bays are that sort of reflection back to the beginnings of the Renaissance in England. A very charming residence was vicar there in Scarborough, which was, of course, an important seaside resort. And to show you this thing, that was designed by Bodley, who was also, generally speaking, a Gothic revivalist. A good one, too. Now, in London itself, in Kensington, there is this house, which has considerable historic interest, since it was the residence of William Makepeace Thackeray, the English writer and novelist, who was one of the principal novelists of the mid-years of the 19th century, he and Dickens. Thackeray's house was rather grand, and this house is intended, I think, to pick up the idea of the 18th century in a very generic, general way. And since he was a well-known writer, may have been very influential in the cut. And it's brick, and it has double-hung windows, the balustrated roof. I don't see any particular medievalizing. And yet there are some others very close to it that I just won't show you here because it could go on and on forever, that have some of that with it. But it's a very attractive house and very influential. That is said to have been built in 1860 to 61. And he didn't live very long after that. He died rather soon afterwards. But at any rate, there it is. Now, at Kew Gardens, the great botanic garden, there is one of the lodges at one of the gates to Kew Garden. This lodge was built in 1866 by the architect Eden Nesfield. And it's the most charming, delightful, it's a residence, for the gatekeeper. Little square box with a great high hip roof of red tile, red brick, and an enormous chimney, paneled chimney, they like that, rising right up the middle. It's typical of what we're going to think of as Queen Anne, perhaps more than any of the things that I have shown you before this, up to this point. But remember, Anne, it has a connection to the principal architect for the Queen Anne, Richard Norman Shaw, because Nesfield and Shaw were partners for a while in the 60s. And in fact, it may be that Nesfield was the person who sort of got Shaw onto this kind of design, which is Queen Anne. Well, here is a house in Bayswater of 1871. And this was designed by a man whom I don't know very much about, Stevenson, who was, in fact, quite a prominent architect. And this was done in 1871, and it's been called the Red House. Well, obviously, like the Red House, Bexley Heath, only this is even redder. It's right there in central, not exactly central, but as far as we're concerned, it would be central London here. Well, not such a great design, but that is clearly this mixing of Renaissance styles and so forth with Queen Anne. This is a house that was done by Nesfield. And it's in the northwest of England. It's called Lee Wood, L-E-A, Lee Wood House, and built in 1870 to 76. The last one is sort of 71. And this is a view looking up the drive. There's a gatehouse to the left, and then you see this house, and it has a mixture of some half timbering even, a brick and stone, and what's more, it has on the back side hung tile. And that was to be another feature of the Queen Anne in England. And we didn't have much hung tile in America, but they managed to make shaped shingles, which give you something of the same effect. If you add this one, has a little lodge as you come in. We were standing right by it when we took the first picture of this. And there you see, has stone base, and then it has hung tile, and red brick, and casement windows, as they could be either. Very flexible. And, of course, eminently picturesque in many respects. That's the kind of thing that is the Queen Anne. Shaw did, he was a very prolific architect, and the Queen Anne style of England is almost more associated with Richard Norman Shaw than Shaw's own house. That's the doorway, and the doorway has a very pretty little cover over it, and you go up to the main floor. The main floor has a little room that overlooks the interior, and he used it as a den or a study. I should have brought a plan. Well, anyway, that doorway is related definitely to the kind of doorway in this, which is a row of 18th century houses in Hampstead called Church Row, and that's where that kind of thing comes from. You see all these 18th century. Now I want to show you right across the street from the front of Shaw's house, there's this house. And this house is by no means the sophisticated kind of architecture that Shaw is capable of doing, but it is worth noticing, and especially as it's right there after looking at his house, and it's probably a little later in the 70s, but it's got, and it's just sort of blob compared to that. So if we had it here, we would like it very much. And it has several things of interest. One thing it has, there are cars. Well, it was 1880, so it's about 6 years later. And then there's this shaped brick. And within that shaped brick, there's flowers, and some of them are sunflowers. And the period was the sunflower was a sort of special motif of the arts and crafts aesthetic movement. And you see, it's got all these features, but it is more humdrum than anything Shaw would have done, and that's the way things are. Now, a whole group of Shaw houses exist in Chelsea, which is down on the river, and along the Chelsea embankment. And we're looking across the river, that's the Thames, of course, and we're looking at some of those houses, of which, well, I won't say, I think a majority are probably by Norman Shaw. The most exciting, the most beautiful one, in my opinion, is this one called the Swan House, sometimes referred to as the Old Swan House. It was built in 1876, and it has these Ipswich windows, and there is some iron in that to help support it, but mostly it's a brick design. And then up above, you notice the variation on little peculiar narrow bay windows and then vertical windows above that. As you see, there are some double hung windows and some casement windows, some leaded casement, and mostly wood. That is the Swan House there on the Chelsea embankment. And nearby it is this house, which, as you see, has a clock and is called the Clock House. And this is by Shaw. And the Swan House, 1876, and the Clock House, 1878 to 80. And it's really quite good. Well, you see the same feature. It's fascinating to see this. And they're a very tall, vertical building. The drawing room is usually on the second floor level, but sometimes it's on the third floor level. considering that the first floor is really a kind of basement. And here is one building that is quite attractive. I showed this at the beginning. This is in Newark, in England, and it is the Lady Ossington Coffee House of 1882. And it was designed by the architect Ernest George. Ernest George and Peto, P-E-T-O, were a firm. And it was designed, it was intended to be a thing for, morality. It was to be a coffee house for workers rather than a pub. But that didn't take very well. At any rate, it is now part of the town offices, unfortunately still there, in the town of Newark, the Ossington Coffee House, 1882, by Sir Ernest George and Peto. Now here's the obviously now. It's done by an architect from Liverpool named Ellison, but it is in Shrewsbury. Built in 1879 to 81. It's the Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital in Shrewsbury. Brick, some rub brick, all kinds of windows. I mean, you can pick out almost anything, and a rather ornamental tower with some terracotta as well as brick. And in this case, the roof is not tile, but different colors slate. I mention that because that happens to be something carried over to the New World, only again, it was frequently done in shingles. This is another house there in Pendleton Park. This is a house, and this was designed by the architect Godwin, called the Courthouse. There are also these houses around there. And it's appropriate enough that the Victorian Society in England should have its headquarters in one of the houses in Bedford Park, but I won't tell you that. This is just a row of houses in Bedford Park, most of them a mixture of stucco, tile, and brick. These are not especially distinguished, in my opinion, but it gives you an idea. It's really rather more suggestive of what happened to this kind of architecture when it was moved across the Atlantic. Finally, and very unusual in the whole Queen Anne mode, is the fact that there is a church for the community of Bedford Park. A church which people have reacted very differently to, some favoring and some not. It's the Church of St. Michael and All Angels, and it's right across the street from the Tabard Inn. And there weren't very many churches that could be put into the period of late 17th century, early 18th century in England. And this is a very free adaptation of what perhaps comes out, perhaps maybe more somewhat medieval than anything else, but it is actually a mixture. The inside of it, with its timber framed roof, it's an Episcopal church with its chancel screen, and with the sort of Gothic arches. It's a very